May 22nd, 1718. Dawn breaks over Charleston Harbor, revealing a nightmare anchored at the mouth of the bay. A massive three-masted warship sits perfectly positioned in the channel, her 40 cannon muzzles trained on every approach to the busiest port in the Carolinas. Black flags snap in the morning wind. On her deck, a tall figure in a long coat studies the harbor through a spyglass, smoke curling from slow-burning fuses woven into his enormous black beard. Edward Teach, the pirate the world knows as Blackbeard, has just closed the throat of an entire British colony without firing a shot. Inside Charleston, merchant captains stare at the harbored monster blocking their escape. The Queen Anne's Revenge outguns every vessel in the colony combined. Her gunners, veterans of naval warfare and Caribbean raids, have positioned her with surgical precision. Any ship attempting to leave will pass within 200 yards of her broadside. Any militia vessel trying to force the blockade will be shredded before closing half the distance. The mathematics are simple and brutal. 40 cannons against wooden hulls equals slaughter. For the next 6 days, nothing moves in or out of Charleston. Ships loaded with valuable cargo sit useless at the docks. Merchants watch their fortunes rot in warehouses. The colonial government, which has spent years boasting about British naval supremacy and the rule of law, discovers that one pirate crew with enough firepower can make those promises meaningless. But Blackbeard isn't here to destroy Charleston. He's here to demonstrate something far more terrifying. That power in the colonial Atlantic doesn't flow from governors or admirals or royal charters. It flows from whoever controls the cannons. And right now, at the entrance to South Carolina's most important port, Edward Teach controls more working artillery than the entire colonial militia can muster. This is the story of how a single warship, 40 gun crews, and one pirate's understanding of strategic geography brought a British colony to its knees. It's a story about the gap between authority and power, about what happens when criminals master the tools of empires, and about the brutal simplicity of early 18th century warfare. Whoever brings the most guns wins. To understand how Blackbeard paralyzed Charleston, you need to understand what the Queen Anne's Revenge actually was. She wasn't built as a pirate ship. She was born as La Concorde, a French slave trader designed to move human cargo across the Atlantic while defending herself from rivals. Blackbeard captured her in November 1717 off the island of Martinique. The ship was already formidable, a 300-ton frigate with 26 guns. But Teach understood something most pirates missed. In the Caribbean theater, artillery superiority wasn't just an advantage. It was absolute power. He immediately began upgrading her firepower. Over the following months, he added 14 more cannons, bringing her total to 40 guns across 2 decks and her main deck rails. These weren't decorative pieces. They were working artillery. 6-pounders, 9-pounders, and 12-pounders capable of firing solid shot, chain shot, and grape shot depending on the tactical situation. The transformation turned La Concorde into the Queen Anne's Revenge and made Blackbeard the most dangerous pirate in the Atlantic. No merchant vessel could match her firepower. No colonial patrol boat could engage her without committing suicide. Even Royal Navy warships in the region had to consider carefully before confronting a vessel this heavily armed. But hardware alone doesn't explain the Charleston blockade. Blackbeard's real advantage was his gun crews. These weren't untrained pirates firing wildly at targets. They were experienced naval gunners, many of them British deserters or former Royal Navy sailors who had turned pirate specifically because pirate crews paid better and beat them less. Each cannon required a team of 4 to 6 men operating in perfect coordination. A trained crew could fire 3 rounds in 5 minutes. An elite crew could manage 4. The Queen Anne's Revenge carried at least 240 men at full complement. That meant Blackbeard had roughly 40 dedicated gun crews, each capable of sustaining continuous fire. In a close-range engagement, his ship could unleash 120 rounds per minute. No wooden vessel afloat could survive that volume of fire. This wasn't the romantic piracy of buried treasure and walking the plank. This was industrial-scale violence, organized and executed with military precision. Blackbeard had created a mobile artillery platform capable of challenging colonial power anywhere it appeared. By May 1718, he had used that platform to raid ships from Virginia to Honduras. He had captured dozens of vessels, accumulated a small pirate fleet, and built a reputation so terrifying that many merchant captains simply surrendered when they saw his flag rather than face his guns. But reputation and firepower only mattered if you knew how to use them, strategically. And Blackbeard was about to demonstrate exactly that. Blackbeard didn't choose Charleston randomly. He chose it because it was vulnerable in precisely the way that suited his capabilities. Charleston in 1718 was the fourth largest port in British North America, exporting rice, indigo, deer skins, and naval stores to England, and importing enslaved Africans, manufactured goods, and luxuries. The harbor was a bottleneck, a single narrow channel between barrier islands where every ship entering or leaving had to pass. That geography made Charleston rich. It also made Charleston controllable by anyone who could anchor a warship in the channel. The colony's defenses were pathetic. South Carolina maintained no naval vessels capable of engaging a frigate. The militia had a few small patrol boats and coastal batteries, but nothing that could challenge 40 cannons at sea. The nearest Royal Navy station was in Virginia, days away by sail. Charleston's security depended entirely on the assumption that no one would be crazy enough to attack a major colonial port in broad daylight. Blackbeard understood that assumption was Charleston's weakness. He also needed something specific. His crew was suffering from syphilis and other tropical diseases acquired during months of cruising Caribbean waters. He needed medicine, specifically mercury compounds used to treat venereal disease. Charleston, as a major port, would have those medicines in the hands of the colony's doctors and apothecaries, so Blackbeard devised a plan that combined extortion, hostage-taking, and overwhelming firepower. He would blockade the harbor, seize prominent hostages from captured ships, and ransom them back to the colony in exchange for a chest of medical supplies. The demands would be simple. The consequences of refusal would be absolute. He would execute the hostages and bombard any vessel that tried to break the blockade. It was piracy elevated to strategic coercion. Blackbeard wasn't just robbing ships. He was demonstrating that colonial authority meant nothing when faced with superior firepower positioned in the right place at the right time. On May 22, 1718, the Queen Anne's Revenge and 3 smaller pirate vessels sailed into Charleston Harbor and dropped anchor at the channel entrance. The blockade began immediately. The first ship Blackbeard captured was the Crowley, a merchant vessel outbound from Charleston carrying passengers and cargo. Among the passengers was Samuel Wragg, a member of the South Carolina Provincial Council, one of the most powerful men in the colony. Blackbeard had just seized a hostage whose life the colonial government could not ignore. Over the next 2 days, his pirates intercepted and captured 8 more vessels attempting to enter or leave the harbor. Each ship was stripped of valuables, each crew and passenger added to the growing pool of hostages. By May 24th, Blackbeard held several prominent Charleston citizens and merchants, their lives hanging on the colony's willingness to negotiate. Inside Charleston, panic spread. Merchants watched their ships trapped at the docks. No one could deliver cargo. No one could sail for help. The entire economic life of the colony had stopped. Governor Robert Johnson faced an impossible situation. He had no military force capable of breaking the blockade. Sending militia boats against the Queen Anne's Revenge would be murder. The colonial militia had maybe a dozen small patrol craft with swivel guns and light cannon. Blackbeard's flagship alone mounted more firepower than the entire harbor defense combined. The governor could request help from the Royal Navy station in Virginia, but a messenger would need days to reach them, and the Navy would need more days to arrive. By then, Blackbeard could execute his hostages and disappear into the Atlantic. Johnson was paralyzed by the same geographic bottleneck that made Charleston profitable. The single channel that funneled all the colony's trade now funneled all its vulnerability. Blackbeard's positioning was perfect. The Queen Anne's Revenge sat far enough from shore that coastal batteries couldn't reach her, close enough to the channel that no ship could pass without entering her killing zone. His gun crews kept watch in shifts, cannons loaded, slow matches burning. Any vessel attempting to force passage would be engaged at point-blank range by multiple gun decks firing simultaneously. The colony's helplessness was mathematical. In naval warfare of this era, effective cannon range was roughly 200 yards for solid shot, less for grape shot designed to shred rigging and crew. The channel at Charleston's harbor entrance was barely 500 yards wide at its narrowest point. Any ship attempting to run the blockade would spend at least 3 minutes within effective range of Blackbeard's 40 cannons. 3 minutes translated to 12 full broadsides from a well-trained gun crew. That meant each of the Queen Anne's Revenge's 20 portside cannons could fire 12 rounds before a target escaped effective range. 240 cannonballs into a wooden merchant ship or militia vessel would reduce it to floating splinters. The geometry made resistance suicidal. Blackbeard had turned Charleston Harbor into a shooting gallery where he controlled every line of fire. On the morning of May 25th, Blackbeard sent a delegation ashore under a flag of truce. The message was simple: deliver a chest of medicine worth roughly 300 pounds sterling, or he would send the hostages' heads into the harbor one by one and burn every ship he'd captured. The demand was deliberately modest. Blackbeard wasn't asking for a fortune. He was asking for something the colony could easily provide, making refusal indefensible. The real message wasn't about the medicine. It was about power. A pirate crew was dictating terms to a British colonial government, and that government had no choice but to comply. Governor Johnson convened his council. The debate was brief. No one argued for refusing. No one suggested military action. The only question was how quickly they could assemble the medicines and get the hostages back alive. But assembling the ransom took longer than expected. Charleston's apothecaries had to gather various mercury compounds, purges, and other treatments from multiple shops and private physicians. Hours stretched into a full day. The delegation Blackbeard had sent ashore waited, growing increasingly nervous that the delay would provoke the pirates into executing Samuel Wragg or the other prominent hostages. By May 26th, Blackbeard's patience was running out. He sent another message: deliver the medicine immediately, or the hostages would die and the blockade would turn violent. The threat was credible. Everyone in Charleston knew Blackbeard's reputation. He had burned ships, he had executed crews who resisted. His psychological warfare, the burning fuses in his beard, the demonic appearance, the calculated brutality, was designed to make threats believable. Finally, on May 27th, the ransom was ready. Colonial officials delivered a chest containing the requested medicines to Blackbeard's shore party. The pirates verified the contents, loaded the chest into their boats, and rowed back to the Queen Anne's Revenge. The next morning, Blackbeard released the hostages. All of them were stripped of their valuables: clothing, money, personal effects, but alive. Samuel Wragg returned to Charleston in his undergarments, humiliated but breathing. Then the Queen Anne's Revenge weighed anchor and sailed north, disappearing into the Atlantic. The blockade had lasted 6 days. Blackbeard had extracted his ransom, demonstrated his power, and left without firing more than a handful of warning shots. He had paralyzed one of Britain's most important colonial ports, using nothing but 40 cannons, strategic positioning, and the willingness to follow through on threats. Charleston was left with a profound and humiliating lesson. British authority in the colonies was an illusion that vanished the moment someone with enough guns decided to ignore it. The Charleston blockade exposed fundamental weaknesses in colonial security that went far beyond one city's vulnerability. First, it demonstrated that the Royal Navy's control of the Atlantic was largely fictional. Britain claimed dominion over the seas through superior naval power, but that power was spread across a global empire. In the Caribbean and the American colonies, the Navy maintained only a handful of warships, none of which could respond quickly to threats. Blackbeard had found the gap between imperial rhetoric and imperial capability, and he had exploited it perfectly. Second, it revealed that colonial militias were useless against organized, well-armed opposition. Charleston's militia existed to suppress slave rebellions and intimidate Native Americans. It had never been designed to fight naval engagements against professional gun crews. When faced with a real military threat, the militia's irrelevance became immediately apparent. Third, the blockade proved that the economic structure of the colonies created strategic vulnerabilities. Charleston depended on a single harbor for all its trade. That concentration of economic activity made the city wealthy, but it also created a single point of failure. One warship in the right location could shut down the entire colonial economy. Governor Johnson understood these lessons painfully. After the blockade ended, he wrote to London requesting permanent naval support and better harbor defenses. His letters described the terror the blockade had caused and emphasized the colony's helplessness in the face of organized piracy. But London's response was slow and inadequate. The British government was more concerned with European wars and Caribbean sugar islands than with protecting minor colonial ports. Charleston would have to defend itself. The psychological impact on Charleston's population was severe. For years, colonists had believed that British power guaranteed their safety. The blockade shattered that belief. Merchants realized their fortunes could be held hostage by anyone with sufficient firepower. Planters understood that their coastal plantations were vulnerable to raids. The entire social order, built on assumptions of British naval supremacy, suddenly felt fragile. Blackbeard himself seemed to understand the broader significance of what he'd accomplished. He didn't just rob Charleston, he humiliated it. He forced a British colonial government to negotiate with a pirate crew, to meet a pirate's demands, to admit publicly that it lacked the power to protect its own citizens. This wasn't just about medicine or money. It was about demonstrating that power in the Atlantic world didn't flow from royal charters or legal authority. It flowed from whoever controlled the means of violence. And for 6 days in May 1718, Edward Teach controlled more violence than the entire South Carolina colony. Blackbeard's triumph at Charleston was also his undoing. The blockade was too visible, too humiliating, too public. He had crossed a line from being a criminal problem to being a political problem. Governor Johnson immediately sent urgent dispatches to Virginia and London describing the blockade and demanding action. In Virginia, Governor Alexander Spotswood took the threat personally. Spotswood had been trying to suppress piracy in the region for years, and Blackbeard's audacity at Charleston was a direct challenge to his authority. Spotswood assembled a military expedition specifically to hunt down Blackbeard. He commissioned 2 small sloops commanded by Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy, armed them with sailors and marines, and sent them to find the pirate captain. By November 1718, Maynard had tracked Blackbeard to Ocracoke Inlet in North Carolina. On the morning of November 22nd, Maynard's sloops engaged the pirate crew in a savage close-quarters battle. Blackbeard's cannons shredded Maynard's rigging and deck, but the naval officer pressed the attack anyway. When the vessels crashed together, hand-to-hand combat erupted. Blackbeard fought like the demon his reputation promised. He took 5 pistol balls and 20 sword cuts before finally collapsing. Maynard's men decapitated him, hung his head from the bowsprit, and dumped his body into the sea. The Charleston blockade had made Blackbeard too famous to ignore and too dangerous to tolerate. Within 6 months of paralyzing one of Britain's major colonial ports, he was dead. The story of Blackbeard's blockade of Charleston isn't a romantic pirate adventure. It's a case study in how power actually worked in the early 18th century Atlantic world. The blockade succeeded because Blackbeard understood 3 fundamental truths. First, firepower multiplied by positioning equals control. 40 cannons in the right location were worth more than superior numbers of ships in the wrong location. Second, colonial governments existed on credit borrowed from the assumption that British military power would arrive if needed. Blackbeard exposed that assumption as false. Third, in the absence of overwhelming force, governments negotiate. Charleston had no choice but to pay the ransom. The colonial response to the blockade revealed deeper structural problems. Britain's empire in the Americas depended on the illusion of invincibility backed by distant, stretched thin military resources. When that illusion cracked, as it did at Charleston, the entire system's fragility became visible. The blockade also demonstrated the evolution of piracy from opportunistic robbery to strategic coercion. Blackbeard didn't just steal cargo, he weaponized geography, used hostages as leverage, and extracted concessions from a government. He had learned to think operationally, not just tactically. He treated the Queen Anne's Revenge not as a raiding vessel, but as a strategic asset capable of projecting power over an entire region. The fact that one pirate crew with 40 cannons could shut down a major colonial port for 6 days without significant resistance should have been a warning to British authorities about the precariousness of their American holdings. It wasn't heeded. Within 60 years, those same structural weaknesses would allow 13 colonies to successfully rebel against the empire. For Charleston, the lesson was permanent. The city never again relied solely on distant British protection. After 1718, Charleston fortified its harbor, built proper defensive batteries, and maintained patrol vessels. The blockade had taught the colony that security couldn't be assumed. It had to be built, maintained, and defended locally. For pirates, the blockade represented both the peak and the limit of what maritime criminals could achieve. Blackbeard had proven that a well-armed pirate crew could challenge colonial power directly. But he had also proven that such challenges invited overwhelming retaliation. After Blackbeard's death, the British government cracked down hard on piracy throughout the Caribbean and American coast. By 1725, the golden age of piracy was effectively over. The Queen Anne's Revenge herself ended ignominiously. In June 1718, just weeks after the Charleston blockade, Blackbeard ran her aground at Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina. Whether through accident or deliberate beaching to downsize his crew and keep more treasure for himself, the great warship that had paralyzed Charleston ended her days as a wreck in shallow water. The final accounting of the Charleston blockade reveals its true significance. Blackbeard held one of British America's most important ports hostage for 6 days using 40 cannons, strategic positioning, and credible threats. He extracted his ransom, humiliated the colonial government, and escaped without serious resistance. But that success marked him for death. Power, as Charleston learned, is temporary. Authority backed by distant force is an illusion. And in the brutal arithmetic of colonial warfare, whoever controls the cannons makes the rules, until someone arrives with more cannons. Blackbeard's severed head, hanging from Maynard's bowsprit as a trophy, was the Empire's answer to the question his blockade had posed. What happens when criminals master the tools of power? The answer was simple and final. The Empire kills them, slowly rebuilds the illusion of invincibility, and continues as if the challenge never existed. But for 6 days in May 1718, Edward Teach proved that the illusion could be shattered by anyone willing to bring enough guns to the right place at the right time. And Charleston never forgot.